Hi, Nicholas.
Hi, David.
You and I are gathered today for a conversation across our slightly different worlds. So you're a Catholic priest from the Passionist order. I'm a musician and a writer and a poet from a post-evangelical kind of world. I thought it would be good to begin by sketching our worlds a little bit. Mm-hmm. Could you begin by just sketching out what your world looks like and what it is to be a priest in the Passionist order?
Right. How long have we got? I'm looking forward to a conversation, because I think conversations that come from different spaces and are open and are free-flowing often take us to places we don't always sort of expect to go. And that's been something, in a sense, that I've not always anticipated in terms of when I joined the religious order, the Passionists. I didn't anticipate some of the places that it would take me, but it's been a fascinating journey for me. And I don't know how far I would be regarded as typical, but it's been a journey that's taken me from my home originally, which is in Warrington, through the various years of studying, which there's quite long preparation to joining the order and eventually becoming an ordained priest. And then subsequently, I've had wonderful experiences living in Italy, in Rome, and then in Paris, and then in London. But I suppose the most wonderful experience really began in 1971, when I began to live and work in the Liverpool 8 area, as we call it in Liverpool, which is better known nationally as Toxteth, where I moved with another priest. And basically that has remained my home since then, and that's where I'm coming from. And I've remained a Passionist now since the 1950s, and still going strong, hopefully, and that's where I'm coming from.
Mm. Well, I've grown up in an evangelical environment, really. My family, my parents were evangelicals of one kind or another, a little bit Pentecostal, a little bit Methodist, and I've been part of that world, I suppose, most of my life. And yeah, mostly a sort of a very active and committed. I've worked in that world and so on. I suppose gradually, bit by bit, I found myself among many people who've been immersed in that environment, who've developed partly through ethical questions, partly through political commitments, partly through theological questions, developed onwards into what people would begin to describe as a post-evangelical kind of space, which is a kind of an exciting place to be. I think if you're a post something, you're aware that you're not you're neither the thing that was nor the thing that is becoming. You're sort of this. You're like the cream between the bits of sponge, which is a place of kind of homelessness in a way, but also a place that's very fertile, interesting, and full of beautiful connections to the past and to the evangelical world, but also full of controversies and questions and sometimes antagonisms. So, yeah, those are the kind of energies that go on in my faith world.
Well, I can really identify with that. Obviously, I'm coming from a different tradition. Most people, they're not used to, don't know a lot about the Catholic Church, would see it as a very hierarchical, structured organisation. But in fact, there's a lot more variety within that large tradition than possibly people realise. And when I was saying before about feeling privileged in terms of the way my own journey has gone, I think perhaps at the heart of that privilege has been the freedom I've found to both still find myself within the tradition, but not to be inhibited in terms of being open to the various opportunities, the challenges, the tensions, as you put it, that come with ploughing a personal furrow in a way that doesn't necessarily fit in with where everything's about. Whether you describe yourself as a post-evangelical, and I see the point you're making about something post, it means you've moved on from it. I wouldn't tend to use that term for myself, but I do identify with the meaning of what you're saying. In other words, I feel that there's elements in terms of how I understand my belonging to the Passionists, how I understand my Catholic priesthood, how I understand the way that my life and philosophy has been changed, means that I'm in a very different place now to when I first started. So I would feel a sort of a deep sympathy in terms of our mutual starting point, even though we might have begun at different places, and undoubtedly we're probably at very different places now. But I think the journey has got potentially a lot in common between us.
I've got all sorts of pessimisms about the world today, but one of the things I feel enthusiastic about is that it seems to me that more and more of us are finding ourselves in a place where dialogue across difference is possible. I suppose looking into another group from the outside, everybody looks of a piece. So, from a Protestant or an evangelical perspective, in that, your infancy in that world, a Catholic is one of these. And then the more you connect in, of course, the more you see the diversity that's held, and the difference, and the dissonance, and the paradoxes, all within a group that you'd kind of, to begin with, probably understood as being a particular thing. I wonder what it is about your place in, as a Passionist priest, that has enabled you to connect with all kinds of different walks of life, because I get the impression that that's what's happened for you. You haven't been stuck in a homogenous space, have you?
No, well, thanks for saying that. I'm glad you're picking that up. I feel that part of the strength that joining this particular religious order gave me was that the underlying commitment within it was pretty deep, and enabled it. It would take a lifetime of sort of research into it to sort of begin to understand what it meant. Because basically, we're called the Passionists. I mean, it's probably a strange name to people who don't know about us. Why are we called the Passionists? Well, the man who founded us, who was an Italian in the 18th century, had a particular focus on the fact that in the Christian tradition, the culmination of Jesus's life was the fact that he died, and that's often referred to as his passion. And in the 18th century, when Paul was beginning to sort of explore his own sort of intuition, that spirituality, the spirituality, the heart of human struggle, can often end in what appears to be a tragic failure, an end, namely death on a cross in that case. So when I first heard about the Passionists, I thought, well, that's a pretty challenging sort of concept. And I was only young; I didn't sort of fully realise it. But I thought it's a sufficiently all-embracing starting point that would enable me to continue to explore that, hopefully with others, with the support that came from joining a community, and would enable me to see where it took me. I still had very clearly, out of my Catholic background and education, a pretty clear idea of what I thought it was going to take me. And becoming a priest, for instance, and becoming a priest would have a certain way of actually acting, and the sort of the role that the priest would follow was all fairly clear cut. But always at the back of my mind was the fact, well, yeah, it could be a lot more than I'm even beginning to realise. And I think the way that circumstances developed for me meant that I was challenged fairly early on in my 20s to sort of begin looking a little bit more deeply at how that could actually develop, and that then sort of developed further into an opportunity that came in my late 20s to step outside the cultural framework of the monastic life that I was part of, and sort of say, well, let's continue the search, but from another starting point. So I think that was the beginning of where the movement began to become more radical and more meaningful for me.
I'm fascinated by that shift. I'm fascinated to know. Well, firstly, the realm of religious orders is a sort of mysterious thing to the outsider, but also how can that become constraining? What developments have been on the table, or are on the table in terms of how to be what we are today now, and what does the world of the present ask of us and demand of us. In my circles, thinking about the crucifixion of Jesus is an interesting question, because people have become quite aware of how the Passion of Jesus can be either used as a sort of a flag of power, almost a colonizing force. There's all these kinds of songs and worship choruses that sound quite militant and colonial, and the cross is a sign by which you conquer.
Yes.
As now, who was it? Constantine.
Yes.
Once said that spirit's alive and well. And then, on the other hand, actually, I think that energy comes when we talk about the cross, the cross. When we talk about the passion and we talk about the person, Jesus, a human being suffering, dying, then we have a story and an image of suffering, of human suffering, of God's suffering, of solidarity with the worst that human beings experience. So it's very much in focus at the moment in my circles. The paradox of those things, are they to be held as a paradox? Or do we just need to lean into the questions of suffering? One of the questions that raises about this conversation, we're talking across lines of difference. There's a Catholic Protestant difference, there's an intergenerational difference, there's just differences of experience. And then, of course, we're also two white men conversing. And the people who've created the world and the power structures that have sort of dominated the world over the last 500 years, certainly, have been people who look like us. I'm interested on your thoughts on what's the most fruitful thing that happens in a conversation across this line of sameness, as well as the lines of difference we have.
Yeah, you have a lot of questions wrapped up in that one. I mean, you're talking about, going back to what you said about the way that the death of Jesus, the crucifixion, can be manipulated. I totally agree with you. It can be manipulated in all sorts of ways from the point of view of how power is exercised in the name of the cross. It can be in that direction. I think it is also manipulated in terms of how we see God, because a lot of theology would say, oh well, mankind or humankind has fallen, has committed sin. God is angry. God needs a sacrifice to be made, and then a lot of theology would say, oh well, therefore he sent his son, and his son suffered, and once his son had suffered, God was then okay. Now that is a theology I cannot accept, and do not believe that. I think it's a manipulation of how we see religion and how we see power projected onto God. So, I mean, there's huge questions there in terms of how we see the suffering, and coming back to the point you're making, about the privileged position that you and I have as white, educated, relatively affluent, male members of the species. I think that's a huge one, because I feel that so much religion starts with big presumptions about that, and sort of this is the norm. Now, whether it's Catholic or whether it's Protestant, I would suggest that you can find examples in both traditions that exemplify it, and possibly not just in Christian traditions either. I feel that the whole religious question is fraught with the danger of manipulation, where we say we're serving God or we're serving humankind, and in fact what we're doing is serving ourselves. So there's huge questions there. And I feel that the exploration of those has got to be done, particularly for the likes of you and me, alongside people who have not got the privilege and have not had the chances and have not been given the all clear, as it were, that the stamp of approval that you are in the triangle, you are way up the triangle in terms of power. So a key point that I would feel, and in a sense this goes back to our founder. From another reason why I joined the Passionists was that Paul of the Cross, probably a man before his time on many, many levels, but he had this instinct of saying that starting off a new congregation, a new Passionist, a new religious order, he said, let's us always choose the places that others don't want to go to. If there's areas where there's poverty, if there's areas where there are less resources, let's make those our priority. So it was perhaps wrapped up in a language and in a cultural way of expressing it historically that we wouldn't use today. But I think the germ of the idea was there, that this is not just about a nice spiritual feeling of how do we sort of relate to Jesus' passion 2,000 years ago, but how do we begin to find it lived out, active, involved today in the world in which we're living. And perhaps the people who need most help in that are ourselves. So it's coming back to your thing about the privilege. I think that the key lesson I learned in moving into Liverpool 8, as we call it, to Toxteth, which is an inner city area of Liverpool, for those of you who don't know, for anybody who doesn't know Liverpool. And it's where largely the black community, which is not an immigrant community predominantly, is one of the oldest black communities in the UK, and it's there that it has been concentrated. And in moving in there, we, myself and another priest friend, Father Austin Smith, the main motivation was precisely we need to go in to learn what it is to actually face the sort of limitations of poverty, of discrimination, of racism that were endemic and are endemic in that situation. And we were the ones going in to learn as white men of power. And how do we learn to walk alongside the people there so that they can help us to filter, to realize, to dig deeper in our own sort of background, history and self-understanding, to say, well, how can we get closer to the reality of what that event on Calvary was all those years ago, as lived out there today? I don't know whether I'm making any sense on that one, but I'm identifying with the point you were making about the privileged position from which we're coming, and which sadly often predominates in church type, in many church, not all, but in many church sort of plans, strategies, outreach, communications. It starts from that point of view, the privilege. We are coming to do something for you. Can I tell you a story on that?
You can, yeah.
The very first day we moved into this tiny little flat. This in Toxteth. But we were coming from the tradition of the Passionists, and there was a Passionist community in St. Helens not far away, and the men in the community there said, oh, well, we'd like to come and celebrate with you this very first day. Now, it was going to be a celebration of Mass by a group of priests from the order. There weren't any other people there. But it was in this tiny space, and we were proceeding with the Mass, and there were prayers being said, and people were encouraged to join in. And it came to one priest who's it was a good friend, and he'd supported us going there. And his prayer was something along the lines of saying, well, dear God, we thank you for this moment when Austin and Nicholas are coming into this poor area, and this poor area of Liverpool, and we thank you for bringing them here, and we know that you will be with them so that they are able to take your good news and spread it and help these poor people in terms of what they're facing. And I could feel the hairs on the back of my head beginning to sort of like stand up a bit, because I didn't see it that way. I saw it very much as even though I wasn't able to put it clearly, I knew that it was more that we were coming into an area that was already rich in many human. It's a wonderful story of Toxteth. It's a tremendous community. And I thought, it's there that we've got to relearn what it means to be priests, what it means to be Passionists. So I then I sort of countered the prayer that had just been said by my own, which was basically saying, well, hang on a minute, God, keep that one in mind, but in the meantime, I hope you're going to help us to sort of like be open enough to really sort of get to the point of like saying that we're going to have to re-examine a whole series of cultural and educational experiences and language to find another way of finding ourselves as good neighbours alongside those who are there. So it's a bit anecdotal, and I've slightly sort of caricatured it a bit, but actually essentially that was the case, that we were seen, we'd fought to get permission, and we had to as a democratic sort of organisation, to get permission to actually step outside. I'd been living in a big monastery in London at the time, and Austin had been doing various other things. So we were stepping completely outside the usual Passionist tradition. And we were immediately faced in that very first encounter with the expectations from our own group. This is coming back to the Catholic group. We hadn't even begun to find out who the neighbours were or where we would begin on that level. So that was just the beginning of the journey. That was in October 1971, which I shall never forget. And I would count that as the real start of a new education for myself, which is still going on. I wouldn't say it's completed by any means. Perhaps I'm a little further on, I hope so, than I was then.
I wrote a song recently, which was a sort of retelling of the Tower of Babel myth. And I think it was it was partly inspired by the way that COVID has sort of stopped the economic machine that we're all kind of in for a time, which resonated with the idea of everybody just being obliged to stop building this tower for a moment, not to romanticize the pandemic, but I suppose it was feeling towards the way in which to power what salvation looks like is gathering everybody into your city, mm-hmm. into your power. Mm-hmm. But actually, the Babel stories, salvation is stopping, your quest for power, mm-hmm. and dispersing, mm-hmm. being integrated with all things and all peoples, and relinquishing that power. Salvation's outside your city, mm-hmm. not within it. You find it out there. You don't bring people into it. In our conversations about this conversation, I think we've been aware that it's a conversation about change, change in our own groups and tribes and environments, but also broader change. Yes. It's not just our own world that's changing, so everything is changing. Yes. And the world is always changing, but I think there are times when there's a threshold of profound change. A theme that you brought up a number of times was the language of the funeral, or the undertaker and the midwife, ending well what's ending, being ready to facilitate what's coming into being, even if it's not your old thing, So I think we're going to continue in the next conversations to explore some of those things.
Okay, good.